Ani, bonjour, Tanzi Sega, welcome everyone. My name is Nochmoen Mushkogiansk, better known as Philip Cote III. I belong to the Underwater Panther clan, and I'm also a band member of Moose Deer Point First Nations. Today, I'm here to share with you a traditional land acknowledgement. ArtworxTO, Toronto's Year of Public Art 2021, and the City of Toronto would like to acknowledge our presence on the land that has been the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee peoples since time immemorial. And in 1805, with the signing of the Toronto Purchase, is now the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. As we reach back to those first Torontonians, we remember our Mother Earth through the 7 grandfather teachings: wisdom, bravery, respect, honesty, truth, humility, and love. The stories of each of these nations endure and continue to guide our thoughts and actions on this land. And as we acknowledge our Mother Earth, we acknowledge the medicine wheel and its teachings. We recognize the 4 directions: north, south, east, and west, and the 4 seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. It is these 4 seasons that represent the circle of life. Nindanawe Maganidak, which means all my relations, which means we are all related. Aho, miigwech matakuyasan. Hey y'all, oh yeah.
And thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Rebecca Carbin. I'm principal and founder of ART+PUBLIC UnLtd, and I've been working with the incredible ArtworxTO team on several aspects of the ArtworxTO program, and my own team, Sagan McIsaac and Michelle Chiloshchik, on its rollout. I'm excited to be back here with you for our 7th episode of the ArtworxTO Talk series, live at 5. We have a new development in the Talks program, thanks to Stella Artois, ArtworxTO's official beer sponsor, for supporting these talks. Stella Artois wants to help you make time for the important things in life and make sure you enjoy your personal time after work, making sure to head to Stella Hour Finder to reclaim your 5 to 9, which syncs up nicely with our talk starting at 5 p.m. ArtworxTO is a full year of public art programming unfolding across the city of Toronto that aims to greatly diversify the opportunities for artists and audiences to engage in art. There are over 1,400 artists involved in the program and more than 300 new installations, murals, screenings, performances, and events. We kicked off our year in the last quarter of 2021, and I'm really excited about what's in play into 2022. We're now more than halfway through our ArtworxTO Talk series, through which we've been highlighting some of these projects among other amazing public art initiatives taking place around town this year and, frankly, every year in Toronto. Live at 5 is a series of talks about some overarching issues within public art practices today, loosely arranged around ideas of art and health and the intersection of these two. So we've been examining 5 themes over 10 events, and our conversations to date have been really rich and inspiring, and I'm so pleased that all are recorded and live online in the ArtworxTO on-demand library. So I know I will want to return to them again in the future, and they will be a valuable resource for people interested in the various aspects that intersect with art and health in the public. We've looked at so far art and emerging from the pandemic, how artist practices have adapted to public spaces, community building and wellness through the arts, gathering, sharing experiences and positive impacts, and then all access, how do questions about access and accessibility inform a conversation about how public art comes to be in a place, to what end and for whom. And tonight, we're going into our first of 2 chapters titled Defining a Monument Landscape for the Future. I'm really excited about the talent we've assembled virtually today to speak about this timely and timeless issue that sets the stage for understanding the powerful dynamics at play in all practices of art in the public realm. In the fall of 2021, we began the Year of Public Art with a project that Quentin VerCetti will be speaking about today. We invited Monument Lab to conduct an art-led engagement program that would ask Torontonians what's next for Toronto with respect to their monument landscape. Quentin's going to share more on that project with us. And then in our second chapter, Monument Lab will be presenting their findings that will inform the City of Toronto policy around acquisition, deaccessioning, disposal, and recontextualization. So as we're developing that project, I came across a Monument Lab text that stated, each and every monument changes over time. Many are made to last with enduring quality, but not forever, installed with an expectation that years later, someone else will have to contend with them. And that reminds me of a conversation I had recently with an artist who stated that a sense that the monuments we erect today give something to future generations to revolt against. It seems like a nice place to start our conversation today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our amazing moderator, Maya Wilson-Sanchez. Maya is a curator and writer based in Toronto. Her essays, reviews, and exhibition texts can be found in various publications, including the Senses and Society Journal, Canadian Art, the Journal of Visual Culture, C Magazine, and the book Other Places, Reflections on Media Arts in Canada. She has worked in numerous galleries and museums, including the AGO, Gallery TPW, and the Textile Museum of Canada, and has curated exhibitions at X-Space Cultural Centre, the Royal Ontario Museum, and the Art Gallery of Guelph. In 2019, she was an editorial resident at Canadian Art and a curatorial resident at the Art Museum at U of T. The 2020 recipient of the Middlebrook Prize for Young Canadian Curators, Maya is currently curating a 3-part exhibition series for ArtworxTO and teaching at OCAD University. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Rebecca. And thank you so much for the invitation to be the moderator for this wonderful panel. We have an amazing collection of panelists here today, and I am so excited to hear from them. Our first panelist is Quentin Vercetti, and he is an award-winning visual griot artivist and self-described ever-growing interstellar tree. He's one of the world's leading Afrofuturist artographer, coining the term Sankophonology and Rastafuturism, and the founder of the Speculative Arts Movement Canada organization and co-editor of the first Canadian art book of Afrofuturism entitled Cosmic Underground North Side, an Incantation of Black Canadian Speculative Discourse and Understandings. In 2021, he created Stepping Forward into History, the Joshua Global Memorial Monument, which is Toronto's first and currently the only sculpture, a monument of a person of African descent. Also, he is the first visual artist to be commissioned by Carnegie Hall, creating a digital sculpture entitled Astro Sankofa that pays homage to the different Afrofuturist women who have graced the concert venue stage since its inception. Through his work, Quentin VerCetty hopes to engage and inspire hearts and minds further to help make the world a better place, not only for today, but for many tomorrows to come. Please take it away, Quentin.
All right, so greetings, bonjour, and wagwan. I am super honored to be able to speak today, and I'll start my presentation off with speaking on the notions of Afrofuturism. And essentially my definition of Afrofuturism, which I look at it as a way that all creative things can heal from an Afrocentric lens. And at the moment, I'm not seeing the presentation, but that's okay. I hope that folks can keep up. And in addition to speaking about the ways that people can heal from an Afrocentric lens, I felt like it was really interesting to have that perspective looking at monuments, and that was very much informed from my experience being in traveling throughout the diaspora, and essentially recognizing that Canada didn't have a lot of representation about Black history. Specifically, once I learned about Matthew DaCosta, I was very much floored that there wasn't as many contributions in public art that paid homage to who Matthew DaCosta was and his importance, not just for Canadian history, but for world history. And so I began to map out what are the different monuments that exist throughout Canada of people of African descent. And that led to me finding only 17, at the time, only 10 monuments that existed in Canada. This was in 2015. And then by 2018, there was about 16, so there were quite a few that was built. But in Ontario specifically, the Black monuments that exist in Ontario is a quite remarkably low number, granted that we have one of the highest populations. And so there are only 7 monuments that exist currently as we speak in Ontario, which is the Towers of Freedom by Ed Dwight, Mary Ann Shad Carey in Chatham by Artist Lane. Then we have Harriet Tubman in St. Catharines, and then we have Oscar Peterson in 2010, made in 2010 by Ruth Abernathy in Ottawa. And then we have another Harriet Tubman in St. Catharines. And then we have Joshua Glover, which I created. And then we have another statue of Mary Ann Shad Carey in Windsor by Donna Jean Main. Now, the issue with these few monuments is that out of all of them, only one of those representations is actually of a person who was born in Canada, which is of Oscar Peterson. And out of all those representations, only one of them, or only 3 of them were made by a Black artist. And so the 3 sculptures made by Black artists is myself, the one made by myself, the one by Artist Lane, and also the one by Ed Dwight. Now, out of the 3 of us, only 2 of us are born in Canada, which is Artist Lane was born in Chatham, and then myself, who was born in Toronto. And so my intention to essentially auditing Canadian landscape monuments brought me to the attention of Monument Lab, where they were also looking into audit monuments across America and the Americas. And so being one of the fellows, it started to really evolve how I was thinking about monuments and representation. And so in their key findings, and they will speak about it more, they realized that monuments have to change and always have changed, and that the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male, and most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And the story of the United States, as told by our current monuments, misrepresent our histories. Now I realize, wow, Canada is now not so different from America, because essentially the landscape looked exactly the same thing. And so for this project called For the Inquisitive and Critical, I wanted to celebrate the everyday person, kind of like what I saw when I went to places like Ghana, when I went to South Africa, Zimbabwe, where they have monuments celebrating the everyday culture. And I realized we didn't have that. We didn't have monuments that celebrated the idea and that celebrated the everyday person. And so the Inquisitive and Critical monument was really meant to celebrate those who ask questions and challenge society, and those who essentially channel their inner child. And so for this public art piece, we essentially transform a mobile truck into a monument, and paying homage to monuments in critical ways of thinking and critical ways that we can be inclusive with public art. And so essentially, I originally designed what this truck would look like in 3D. And then from there, essentially, we printed in vinyl and wrapped the truck in its totality. And this truck went to 6 different locations across Toronto to represent the 6, which, if folks don't know, is the moniker name of Toronto. And essentially, in each of these locations, we had people interact with the different monuments that they thought were important, and what are some of the monuments that they would like to see, and then what are the different ways that we can change how we think about monuments. And so one of the interesting features on the truck is the 2 sides, the multiple sides to it. On one side is a selection of monuments that essentially was meant to prompt the idea of what monuments could be and not the typical monuments. And so I selected 12 different monuments from across Toronto and put them on the side of the truck to kind of show this idea of inclusive monuments and what they can look like, and put them all in this one singular plane. And then on the reverse of the truck, you have an opening where people can then kind of look into what could be the future, what could be the potential for Toronto. And so one of the key things about this art piece was thinking about the future and working with Indigenous wisdoms. And so I got to work with Karen Recollect to think about how did Indigenous people celebrate their culture, how did they preserve their cultures through public art and public artistic expression. And so in doing that, I got connected to Solomon King and his restoration of identity maquette, which he allowed me to include in the potential of the future of monuments for Toronto. And so essentially, working in 3D allowed me to really expand this idea of how can we think critically. And in short, to wrap it up, we 3D printed, and we had some issues with the 3D printing, so we couldn't make it as big as we wanted to. And so we had signages in different places. And essentially, it really expanded the idea of monument making, because we had this mobile monument being able to be ephemeral, but also move from one place to another. And that also expanded people's idea and imagination. And so we asked people to ask questions, and we had a really great levels of interaction. And so I want to leave you with the question that we started off with. Other than asking you what's next, I would like to ask everyone, what kind of monuments would you like to see?
Thank you so much for that, Quentin. I think that is such an interesting question, and maybe we'll have time to, at the end, to go back to it. I would like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jordan Sook, and he is a contemporary mixed media artist who works and resides in Toronto. Beginning his artistic career in 2019, he has since exhibited work throughout Canada in various shows, notably in Union Station, in the Vancouver Convention Centre, and the McLaren Art Centre in Barrie. His body of work ranges from acrylic paintings to sculptures and installations of recontextualized themes in pop culture. Sook's distinctive personal style emanates youth and playfulness through color, line, and form. The work invites us to view the world from a subjective innocence as we experience a recollection of joyfulness and optimism relating to human infancy. Jordan Sook is inspired by acts of imposition and alteration, recontextualizing elements within pop culture to create new narratives. Sook looks to change the landscape of Canadian art and broaden the framework and understanding of Black art as a whole. So please take it over, Jordan.
Thank you. First off, thank you guys for having me here. It's amazing just to be able to spend some time with some amazing people in the art scene. So hats off to you guys. Really looking forward to just sort of talking on my piece. Thank you for keeping us on track that we did back in 2021 that we exhibited at Union Station. This piece was really, I think, instrumental in telling a narrative that I feel has sort of gotten a chance to be heard within the Canadian scene of late. And I think that the work was really created to tell a story, specifically a story that hasn't really been told before in a unique way. As mentioned, you know, my work deals a lot with objects and things that we sort of find on a day-to-day basis, often referred to as the quote-unquote ready-made. In this sense, I really wanted to abstract the idea and begin to tell the story of the porters who worked on the railroad between the late 1800s to, I believe, the mid to early 1900s. So we're talking 1940s was kind of sort of the tail end of what they worked. But the beautiful thing about this story is it is deeply rooted in obviously Black history, but also Canadian history as well, in that the porters themselves were a group of men who band together over time and eventually formed one of the first labor unions within Canada. And the idea was that after slavery, this was probably one of the better jobs that were out there, readily available for Black men in the workforce. So a lot of Black men took this job on with pride, and it also gave them the opportunity to travel throughout the country. And the best thing I found out through this was that this story really does tie deeply to many communities, and even myself finding out that I had, you know, family history relating to the porter story. I think we could check the next slide. So the porters, they essentially worked on what were known as sleeping cars. And this was pretty much the modern day luxury car that one would stay in overnight. And the porters worked and attended to those that would ride the train. And so the pictures that you're seeing there are representations of what the train or the car, I would say, actually looked like. And these were set to be able to go long distances. You know, people are there spending days on end within these cars. And these men worked long hours, pretty much, you know, almost 24 hours, getting very little sleep, very little rest, only between stops. And it was interesting to see how they would interact with those that were riding the train, predominantly upper class and also white. They would still always have a certain class about them because they knew that this was a job that they should take on with pride. And that is also, you know, one of the things that the work that created, we look to really embody. We could check the next slide. So this picture here is pretty much showing how we got to the conceptual narrative of creating the work. I believe the work speaks to a sense of pride. It's powerful, but it also has what one might call motifs surrounding it. So when thinking on this piece, we were really looking at how the train functioned, both from a technical standpoint, but also from, I guess you would say, explanative or I guess exploratory standpoint, in that the idea of what could be powering the train could be interpreted as both the porters working on the train as well as the coal that was powering it. And so what I did was interpret the hats that they all seem to wear as a common theme, as well as the coal that was technically powering the train, thinking on the porters that were working tirelessly also powering the train. And I pretty much took the idea of a mound of coal and tried to translate that to the idea of the hats, multiplying that over 2,400 hats. Obviously, it took a little math to get the exact number down that we wanted based on the scale. But the idea is that this piece is alive and that these men could have almost thrown these hats in this pile together. And really the idea was to tell the story of togetherness, of unity, of collectiveness, and a story that not only resonated with the Black community, but the Canadian community as a whole, in that we can all identify with the idea of hard work, the idea of a labor union, the idea of togetherness. And I think those are themes that really tie this piece to sort of the greater narrative of both Black art as well as Canadian art. And I mentioned in the beginning that this story is a story that is being told more and more and being brought to the forefront. And recently CBC has sort of taken on a new series called The Porter, where you could literally watch a dramatized series of the life of a porter throughout working on the car as well as their home life and that balance. So I do believe that the work is sort of a part of a zeitgeist with it of this story, and really something that I think does, like I said, tell the story of Canada in a broader scope.
Thank you so much for what a great presentation, Jordan, and what a great example of such a meaningful site-specific project too. I got to see it at Union Station and it was just so monumental and used the space so wisely. Thank you so much for telling us about it. So our next presenter is Sandra Laronde, and she is a highly accomplished arts leader, innovator, and creator. She's a multidisciplinary artist working as a director, producer, choreographer, author, digital storyteller, and as the founder of the artistic director of Red Sky Performance. She is from the Teme-Ogama Anishinaabe, people of deep water in Temagami, Northern Ontario, and based in Toronto. She drives her passion unwaveringly forward to elevate Ontario arts while playing a pivotal role in the ongoing Indigenous cultural resurgence in Ontario and beyond. For 3 decades of counting, her work highlights the power of contemporary Indigenous performance, enabling new creations to expand the scope of Indigenous-led work in Ontario, Canada, while strengthening a worldwide presence. Sandra has represented Canada on international platforms, included Unceded Voices at the Venice Biennial, 2 cultural Olympiads, so Canada and Beijing, and 2018 Canadian Heritage's first creative industries trade mission to China, and will be on the 2022 trade mission to Europe. Wow, that's so impressive. I'd like to welcome Sandra.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Misko Gijugatkwe, Tumigma Anishinaabe and Dunjba. I am from the people of the deep water in Temagami, Northern Ontario. And I'm situated here in Toronto, which is very much the home of Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of New Credit. So thank you for having me as part of this. I guess I have more questions than anything that I would love to just pause it and air with you and sort of dream up what could be together. So, you know, one of the things, of course, is a really sort of, you know, an obvious questions and not so obvious question, I guess, is, you know, where are the Indigenous monuments in Canada? Where are they? And when we see them, I mean, as someone had mentioned, they're usually around the war with a colonial power higher up, and then a sort of Indigenous people at the bottom. So it's already telling that story, a colonial narrative is very much what I see in terms of monuments around Indigenous people. And then it makes me think about, because I'm in dance and theater and music and media, it does make me think about, could monuments be something else other than encased in bronze or pewter or whatever people are cast in? Could we be cast differently? Could monuments be something living and breathing and more sort of temporal, but to have lasting impact, as opposed to something that is just there and sort of not breathing and something that really doesn't change? So that's interesting about, you know, the factor of change and whether a monument could be something living and breathing and fluid, and something more focused forward facing, as opposed to always looking in the past or something that happened. Could it be, you know, a testament, or could it be something that we want to do in the future? And could we build that and then sort of build the steps towards that future just by having the image, whatever that image is going to be? So, because as we know, Indigenous people are always somehow cast only in the past. So it makes me think about, how could we see ourselves in the future and have people also see ourselves in the future? Because we are still very much seen through sepia and through a sort of a lens that is always somehow historical or in the past. Could a monument have a voice? Why do monuments have to be voiceless as they are? Could they have a voice? And embodied. And since monuments are basically a story sort of frozen in time, but perpetuates that story, is there something that we could do with a monument that is more sort of porous and more in the world of storytelling or dance or media or music or something, or in the language even, to hear Indigenous languages across Canada? Wouldn't that be nice to hear that? We also create shows for children. I just want to let you know where we're at in Canada. We create shows for children, and every single show has this question. because the show that we're doing is sort of focused on, it's a Cree speaker. And every child lifts, every single show, they put up their their hand and they say, is Cree a real language? And that's from a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, very honest. And, you know, but that's kind of the lay of the land in terms of even the next generation not quite even knowing that Indigenous languages are alive and well, or even Indigenous people are. So, so I think, you know, how do we imagine if a monument in the future? And do monuments always have to be about people? Could monuments be about the land itself, or about, you know, even non-human beings? Could it look, or could it be somehow shared in that space with other humans? There's I find for the most part, monuments are very human-centric, and I just wonder if there's another way to show, you know, our world in a very different way, or from an Indigenous worldview that might be much more holistic in approach. So those are some of the questions that I have more than anything around monuments. We were part of New Monuments with Canadian Stage and Luminato, where we built a show together that's on CBC Gem. And so that was really interesting, working with other Indigenous people and people in the BIPOC community, or IBIPOC community, you know, so that was all really great to do something together. And it's so complex in that space. And that's the one thing we definitely all took away, is the complexity of this and the meaning of a monument, and how much is encapsulated in a monument, and how do we change that? How do we affect change? And how do we do it together without losing someone else's voice, without overshadowing someone else's voice in the mix? Shimmikwich.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was such an interesting set of questions. Maybe we can come back to them. I really want to. Definitely food for thought. Thank you so much. Our next speaker and our last speaker is Karen Carter, and she is a cultural sector executive who enjoys working in creative and educational environments. She has over 25 years of experience working and volunteering in a range of arts, culture, and heritage settings. She's a former executive director of Heritage Toronto, a City of Toronto agency responsible for the education and promotion of Toronto's heritage. She's the founding executive director of Myseum of Toronto and co-founder of Black Artists Networks and Dialogue, an organization dedicated to the promotion of Black arts and culture in Canada and abroad. She's also the founder and president of Karen Carter and Associates Cultural Consulting, a firm that focuses on building new community-centered cultural organizations, projects, and initiatives. She's founder of C-Art, a Caribbean art fair launched in January 2020 in Mandeville, Jamaica. C-Art is a new approach to the contemporary art fair model, connecting artists from the Caribbean region to the international art world. Karen's most recent project is a co-founder of the BIPOC Fellowship to help support the development of a more diverse cultural landscape in Canada. Take it away, Karen.
Intro, and it's, I don't know about the rest of you, but I always hate hearing the resume read out. It's kind of like, oh God, stop. Thank you for the invitation, Rebecca, and it's an honor to be following a lady, Sandra Laronde. And it's also an honor because I think she's foreshadowed really nicely where my thoughts are at around rethinking monuments. So it feels like maybe it was an accident. I'm not sure, that from Quentin to Jordan looking at making of works rooted in historic narratives, and then going to Sandra's contemporary reference, and I think a questioning of why we think about monuments always through this historic lens around what we seem to believe is important for the past and memory, as opposed to how to tell stories that anchor us in the present, and to find ways to think monumental and not just about monuments. So I think my couple of slides will be in line with that position. So this first shot is really just playing on what we know and see has been happening over the last couple of years, with things being ripped down, people's anger viscerally showing up and playing out against these built structures that are an homage to largely colonial understandings of the way the world works, and often a celebration of the men who are seen as important to war, harm, and damage. If you go to the next slide, you're at, I think, again, that conversation, which is rooted in where we are now, which is in line with both Jordan and Quentin's references. This is an image of Thomas Price's work, his monumental sculpture. I believe this was Common Man or Everyday Man, but he has a piece, if you go to the next slide, that's sitting in front of the AGO right now. I mean, the first time I saw this work in 2019 at the power plant, I was awestruck. Like, I remember walking around the corner with a colleague, board member at band, and we were just like, what is happening? Like, an explosion going off in your head seeing this, because to Sandra's point about, you know, I don't associate bronze with Black. So even when it ages, it never really goes to this finish for me. So the fact that it began, it just was this notion of regal, and it just felt like it was kicking every other idea around monumental to the ground, because it was also ordinary in many ways, because it's a guy in a jumpsuit, tracksuit, a hoodie, the Nikes on his feet. Like, you don't get to see the whole thing here in the shot, but if you have not been, and I think it still is at the AGO, if you've not had a chance to, listen, take my foolish little advice. Take some time, take the streetcar, get on a bike, go for a walk, however you get there, drive, but go see this. It'll, especially for those of us who are racialized, who are othered, it will change the way you think about what monuments should or could be. And that is in following the monumental script that we all understand, which is you build a big thing. Thomas is like, he's playing in that space and saying, okay, I'm gonna build a big thing, but I'm gonna build it in a way that is about now as much as it is about the past. Because this isn't a guy in an old suit or in some armor. It isn't, you know, someone who's commenting on the past. It's very much about, we are here now and we have space now, we take up space now. It anchors us in the present, which I think is one layer around this notion of how to think about monuments in different ways, and how to think and present and create in monumental ways instead of just thinking about the physical thing. The next slide takes you into the monumental, and this is from kind of a really simple image of one piece of work that a East African brother, Dawit, did with band a couple of years ago, where he had photographed veterans who were descendants of the Ethiopian-Italian War. So this would have been the second war that would have happened pre-Second World War, because that was an attempt that Italy tried to make to colonize Ethiopia that failed. And I think the Second World War shifted because then Italy had to kind of deal with what was happening in Europe, which was part of the reason why the short-term win they had didn't really result in a long-term colonial presence. So most Ethiopians have the position they weren't colonized because Italy really didn't last there in this second war. But this photo is a representation of that community's monumental attempt to keep that historical thread present, because essentially descendants of the soldiers don their families' military uniforms. And when they do their version of Remembrance Day annually, the uniforms come out, they're worn, the local military artillery that might have been used is all a part of this. What some of us may think of as almost a performance to the homage of history, but it is more a reminder of the importance of them honoring the elders in literally donning the clothing they would have worn in battle. And you have to think how, again, just an image with all of the load of what's represented there is, for me, a monumental way of representing history, because his series of photos shows these people who he said he was there that day. The wall was green, he shot the photos. If you see the series of them, the shades change, so you can see how he moved from highlight to low light, from probably would have been high noon to the golden hour in the change in the shades of the shots. If you go to the next slide, you will see another photo that's on the side of the house abandoned. Again, there's all kinds of narratives I could go into around this piece. The presentation of this image is public art outside of the house. For us, taking up public space with art in ways that are not always about large imagery, but about people encountering ideas around other in their daily life is monumental. It's how you think about the notion of storytelling, narrative, position, place, and community. Because for us, it's monumental because it's constant. Since we've been in this house in 2017, there's always public art. There's always a sense of how the gallery lives outside of the walls of you having to enter the space. And then the last one is just a shot of the street where you can see, again, the series of images. This is what people would see walking up Brock from Queen. This was, one of these weird, this was, I think, end of May. It was winter coming to give spring one last kiss before it exited the stage. And on that note, I will end and just say thank you again for the opportunity and for the seamless way my fellow presenters have woven their narratives into where I'm ending, which is, it's a rethink. It's how you understand history, but also understand the need for telling present stories as a way to inspire future ways of understanding ourselves and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that really thoughtful presentation and also how you connected to the other presentations. We're going to start a short conversation, but I do want to remind viewers that we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions or comments to any of our panelists, please feel free to add it in the chat. So I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you all. I'll just start with the first one. I was going all over because such interesting things that were brought up here. So the last handful of years have marked a time where it feels like we're collectively having a critical conversation in regards to our monuments. And this is not only in the art world, but also in the media and politics and in activists and academic circles. We've seen all kinds of activations, interventions, and protests led by both artists and activists across the world. In Toronto alone, we witnessed Black Lives Matter protests against colonial monuments by vandalizing them with paint and writing. We also saw a large crowd of demonstrators last summer take down the Egerton Ryerson Monument in protest of his contribution to Canada's colonization and residential schools. So I taught a class about monuments just last week, and we discussed how this kind of upheaval and critical approach to our public monuments is not something new, but something that we see happening worldwide in an almost cyclical way during or after revolutions, wars, times of change, and important paradigm shifts within our societies. I'd like to invite you all to reflect on why these conversations are happening now. What marks our time as a time to be having such discussions? And why is it important to do so, to do that work right now as artists, educators, and art leaders? I'm not sure if anyone wants to take a stab at it. So, why now?
I wasn't sure if you were going to cue who you wanted to go first.
Oh, no, anyone can go.
I can just quickly say that I think a lot of it is about, especially in Canadian society, a coming of age of folks who are, they understand systems here. Like my parents wouldn't have been, just from a livability of bills have to be paid, children have to be fed, they wouldn't have been at no protests nowhere. Like they would have been sentimentally, fight the fight, but then they would have been at work. And so there is just the practical level at which people who came of age in society who understand it and feel a comfort and a right to protest. Whereas I think even if my understanding, for instance, of Indigenous communities and the way they protest, some of it is about this idea of, I remember having a conversation with Chief Brian Laforme, who said, it's a nation to nation narrative for Indigenous communities. So the way the protest has gone about is not the same as just someone who's protesting because they're voting for something, because there's also elements where when you layer that nationhood piece in, there are things that go on behind the scenes that may not be as viscerally happening on the streets. But I think all of that suit is showing up in ways where we're seeing public protests, for instance, around things like the pipeline. So you layer environmental, and then you're watching people who are realizing, oh, these aren't separate camps. They're all connected. And so our ability to live well in the land and be healthy, successful humans is connected to the way culture represents, is connected to economics, it's all these things. And I feel like the social media is a big part of that, but I also think there's just a heightened awareness and a comfort for people who feel they should be able to exercise their right to comment in a myriad of ways on what is happening around public policy and public representations of our histories and our narratives. And I think some of that is just, this is a young country, and in the age it is in now, I think there's this soup that makes a lot more of that noise possible in ways that it may not have been even 40 years ago.
Yeah, real quick, just to add to that, I think today's generation, we have that leisure per se to be able to participate. You know, I wouldn't say like the awareness has changed. I think the awareness has always been there, but now we are more aware that we can participate in a certain way to change what's in the public sphere and also contribute to what's in the public sphere. So I think like being more active means that we see more of these activities. And I think that's why we have that happening now. But also it's been building up, right? Like the decolonization process, like the independence process, is still within my parents' generation. You know, my parents were born in a colonial state, you know, and so when they came to Canada, it was still very colonial, and like the conversations around Indigenous sovereignty was very in its infancy. Even to this day, it's still in its infancy, if we're being honest. And so I think with today's generation, we are realizing that it doesn't have to be this way, and that we can add to complicating the narratives, we can add to removing narratives, adding narratives, and also we have more people who are capable of doing these things, right? I'm not the only one who can make a monument. Only Black man in Toronto who can make a monument. There's tons of us now. Like, you know, we have more people to kick in the door and say like, yo, we can hire this person or put that money in that person's pocket. So I think right now we're just in an interesting moment of like essentially having more power in our hands and realizing that.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback off both what Karen and Quentin said. I think we're in an era where we have like hyper access to information, and I think like when we think of like the paradigm shift, there's like a couple key things that have happened. Obviously, Quentin said like this has been building up, but I think there have been things 2020, i.e. George Floyd, you know, that have happened where that heightened level of like access to information like broke to like another barrier, you know. And so it's like when you watch a movie, the first time you ever see someone like get shot, or like you're watching an old war movie and you see like a building get blown up versus like the 100th time you've seen it. And I think what had happened was we reached a new level of like graphic awareness as a society, and it caused us to really reflect on our sense of self and re-question our values and our morals. And I think people felt emboldened to maybe feel like they had to do something or say something about it. The level of effectiveness of all of it is up for debate. I think that the idea of pushing the societal awareness of what we consider these things to be about is really where we are right now. And I think like what we saw was just sort of like the byproduct of like that shock.
I think too, if I could add, is that I mean, it's no coincidence that this thing at X University happened at Ryerson University, because students often are out in front, making things happen. And within Canada now, I think this was a few years ago, you now have about 30,000 Indigenous students graduating from universities and colleges across the country. So you have this young population coming in with a voice, educated in a different way, and being more vocal. So that is like right there is the making of potentially a revolution in Canada in a good way, you know. And just to put it in context, like Indigenous people, we didn't even have the vote in Canada until 1960. Until 1960. So that meant everyone else could vote in this country before Indigenous people. So, you know, I'm just saying that because, and the fact that this generation now, this is you know, out there, it's a really exciting time, and we're more vocal. Truth and Reconciliation across Canada has also made a huge difference in terms of the awareness of the history of Canada in relationship to Indigenous people, and particularly our children. And, you know, so decolonization that is happening, and talking about institutions becoming more decolonized. What does that really mean? What does that really look like? I don't know if there's a really good example out there yet of what that is. So all of these factors, along with what everyone else has said, really makes this the time. It's the time. It's a momentous time. It's a monumental time. And so, you know, now we just have to like really make something happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot to think about there. And we have a question from our viewers directed to Sandra, actually. And I really love this question. So it reads, hello, thank you to all the presenters, such a great talk. For Sandra Laronde, do you see a monument performed, like the conceptual art piece of the Eternal Note, but with people performing, taking place as a public monument in constant happening and transmitted as an oral/body transmission from one performer to another ad infinitum? Thanks.
That's a great question. Thank you very much for that question. I do see it like that. I do see it as sort of this living collective entity that is embodied, that has a voice, that is all these things that I had mentioned earlier. And I think that could be quite beautiful. We did something just recently, we didn't mean for it to happen, but we had a very short little excerpt, and for some reason we were kicked out of the studio just for momentarily, because I think somebody else had to come in or something. So we went outside. I said, okay, let's go outside and practice it then. And so we just went to the park and we did some of it there, and people kept stopping, applauding, having a conversation with us. And we're like, wow, let's go back inside. But there was such a desire to see something like that. And people started taking pictures. And it's wasn't our intention, but it really made me think there's a real appetite in that space. And then could there be kind of a digital monument, you know, that could also be, you know, shared? Could a monument be live streamed? Could a monument be live streamed across the world? Not just Canada, not just Ontario, but with the world, to show who Canada is, you know. Anyway, love the question. And I do see it like that very much, as the transmission. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I also have a question going back to all the panelists. You know, I'm trained as an art historian, and I always think about the work I do as creating a history for the future, a history that embodies your present moment, but uses storytelling to imagine and shape a certain future. And I'm wondering if you can all share how your work imagines a monument landscape for the future. is there an aspect of worlding or world making in your practice? And I think this ties back to, you know, Quentin's idea of, you know, what kinds of monuments do you want to see in the future, but also Sandra's question of, you know, can a monument be forward facing? So I just wanted to pose that question to all of you.
Yeah, I can jump in there real quick. Yeah, the basis of my work is world building because I'm interested in Afrofuturism and indigenous futurities. By default, it is connected to that rhetoric and that ways of thinking. And so the core aspect to my work is looking at this idea of counter monuments. And counter monuments is a word I love to throw around to make not just to sound like I'm educated, but because it's really what that is, right? When you think about monuments, you automatically think about white naked men, or you think of like men on horses, and you think of, you know, all the different ways that propaganda has promoted the idea of a monument. And for whatever reason, we don't think of African masks, we don't think of regalia worn by indigenous peoples as a form of monuments. We don't think actually like back to ancient Africa, like places like Kemet, places like Timbuktu, ancient Ghana, the Nuk people. So all these different practices and different ways that monuments can look. And so for me, I'm really interested in telling the stories of a community, right? Because oftentimes we see monuments representing a singular person, and I'm really interested in representing multiple ideas in one piece. I'm really also interested in the ways that monuments can grow, can mutate, evolve, fractal. You know, I'm looking at new technologies. Why does it have to always be bronze? Is that because, you know, anyways, we're not going to get into exploitation of certain resources and capitalism, but essentially these are the things I'm thinking of, you know. So when I made the Olamina public art piece for the waterfront residency, essentially it has a head wrap, and the head wrap is like a shelving unit. And then it has like a green space in the hair. And essentially I was thinking about like, oh, what if the community was watering this monument, right? And allowing this green space in her hair to grow. And the art piece is a monument to the water deities, right? Mami Wata in Yoruba and West African cultures. And there's so many different names for the different ways that indigenous peoples in different cultures and different groups refer to water as a spiritual essence and entity. And so we don't always have to monumentalize people. We can also monumentalize elements. We can also monumentalize communities. But I think a big part of the practice is being intentional of how is a future use of this physical social contribution going to function. And so that's something that I'm constantly thinking about within my work.
You know, I was just thinking, just to add, I just loved everything you just said, is I was thinking about the Inukshuk, which is Inuit, and the Inukshuk being sort of, I guess, a monument in a way, but it's very practical. Because when you saw an Inukshuk in the traditional way, it meant that there was good hunting there, or there was people nearby. It had a practical application. It meant something. So is there a way to create monuments that actually, you know, that, I don't know, the practicality of something as well is really interesting. And I don't know, I just want to say that. And then our totems from the West Coast, I mean, it's so beautiful. And it's so much about family and their clan system and the family systems and the nation stories and all of that held within that totem, you know. And so, you know, in Ghana, I saw also, and in Mongolia, I saw things that also look very totemic, if you will, in terms of monuments, So I don't know, there's just something about that practicality of a monument as opposed to something only ever being aesthetically sort of pleasing. It's just a question again.
And just to kind of go off of what has been said, I think specifically when it comes to Black art in Canada, I think the future of monuments that I see are works that aren't necessarily rooted specifically in like Black trauma and pain, which a lot of the works are. I think there's definitely a place for those works to be acknowledged. And I believe that that is, you know, something that is important to understanding the history and context. But I think when we're thinking of future monuments, and I think Karen really shared a great example, is works that really tell stories outside of one specific narrative. And I think that's important because indirectly there is a colonial mindset around that in itself, in terms of the understanding of Black art has to be within these specific parameters. And I think within my work, I think one of the things I look to is everyday objects, specifically because of how we as a people interact with our everyday. And I think that is also something that is monumentous in itself, whereas something like a Michael Jordan sneaker can be, you know, interpreted as being monumentous on the same platform as, you know, a slipper of Alexander the Great. Historically, you know, the relevance of the two might seem very divergent, but in the reality, both in their times of context are equally as important to their own culture. So I think when I think of future monuments, I think of things that really help to uplift and unify and bring us all together to a larger conversation.
That's great. Thank you all so much for such insightful presentations and discussions. I love this idea of, you know, creating monuments to ideas, to communities, to land, to other than humans, to think about, you know, materials other than bronze, to think about monuments that change as our communities change and that can adapt with us into the future. Thank you all so much for sharing all these ideas. Thank you so much to ArtworxTO, to Rebecca Carbin, and ART+PUBLIC. And I would like to invite you all to please join us for the next chapter on this topic, which is on May 11th from 5 to 6 p.m. Thanks again and have a good evening.